All right, hello everybody. I'm about to start my SQL presentation now. Should be good to go in just a moment. Sorry about that. So, unfortunately, I think we're gonna have to click through these. Yeah, because something's going wrong with the Zoom where it's not letting you scroll through, but this should be all right. So, my presentation is just on constraints and also multiple constraints over different tables. So kind of, if you were to have two tables and you wanted to constrain two attributes that affected each other or didn't have any effect on each other, you could do that with this type of stuff. So let's get into it. So just as a little bit of background, the main types of constraints that we can use for just single attributes would be not null, unique, primary key, foreign key, and all of those just kind of put different kind of circumstances on variables that you're working with. Now these can either be created with the table when you create it with the create table method, or you can do it after with the alter table statement. That essentially just makes it so after the table is created, you can also add different constraints like adding another foreign key to the table, changing something to be not null, all that kind of stuff. So that's also pretty handy to keep in mind because you can still use that when invoking this stuff as well. So the main difference between what I'm going to go over with the multiple constraints called assertions and normal checks is that assertions can basically check a condition across an entire database, whereas obviously a normal check just goes off one variable within your table. So they need to involve at least two or more tables to be considered an assertion. And a simple example for it would just be that if we had a constraint where we had a table students and we also had a table enrolled where they were enrolled in a certain number of classes, we would have a constraint where, let's say, a student could not be in 5 or more classes. So that would involve both of those tables kind of being tied together to have that assertion. So with that, there would be kind of an error message if you were to try to insert, say, a student and have them take 6 or 7 classes, so that it wouldn't work. And that's actually part of the constraint that we're going to talk about. So we're going to go over this example. I created this a little bit ago. We're going to make 2 SQL tables. One's going to be with employees, and the employees are going to have an employee number, a department, and an age, as well as the employee number is going to be the primary key for that table. And then we're also going to have a table called department, so where the department's going to be the primary key, and they're also going to have a city, both being strings. And then, so after this, we're going to actually use the alter table method that we talked about previously, because we're essentially going to create this condition where if we try to insert an employee into the table whose department doesn't exist yet, it's going to be an error. So the thing about Oracle, at least from what I've seen, is that you can't actually do assertions. It's not supported by them, and I'll get into that later. But this line where we add the foreign key actually kind of creates that circumstance. So we're going to see on the next slide that it actually does that kind of constraint for us. So we can see here, to give you a little bit of background, our department table only had one department. It was D1, just keeping it simple. Department 1, it had a city of New York City. And in this case, we're going to try to insert into the employees table an employee 2, age 50, department 2. And as you can see, we get an integrity constraint violated because the parent key is not found. So even though there is not a way to really do the full-blown create assertion in Oracle, this is kind of a way to get around it. So obviously this is going to help us create that constraint, and since Oracle doesn't support the assertion method, we can't use that syntax to create that constraint within our table. So, but how would we go about kind of creating assertion, and what would it really, entail? So here's a nice example I thought of, especially with the situation now. We can think of the coronavirus situation. So obviously with coronavirus, older people are normally more at risk. So we wouldn't want an older person working in, say, a highly densely populated city or something like that. So the theoretical assertion we would create for this is where an employee could not be inserted if their department is greater, if their department is located in a highly populated city. So for this, we're just going to take New York City as our example. So obviously, this code won't run in Oracle, but this is the gist of it. So we create an assertion. My assertion, this is completely arbitrary. It could be whatever you want to call it. Be called checks. And to make sure this doesn't exist, where we select from employees, where departments is the foreign key, cities isn't equal to New York City, assuming all our employees are older. So some things to note about assertions and that sort of thing. The check constraints are very simple because they only relate to one kind of variable within your table. So it would be like, making sure all employees have ages greater than 18 or 16, depending on what the, child labor laws say. But when we try to bring in assertions, they make things a lot more complicated. And sometimes some database management systems don't even support them, like Oracle in this circumstance. And also, assertions can fully lock you out of the database if you're not carefully checked. And that just kind of, it seems like a good reason to why they're not supported sometimes. But I did come across this useful tool called triggers. And triggers are supported in modern databases. You can almost think of them like an assertion, but a little more handy. So triggers essentially work like assertions, except they can modify data within the database while doing that check, right? So let's say, for instance, we wanted to kind of accomplish the same thing with our coronavirus example. We wanted to create essentially a check that an employee cannot be in a densely populated city, right? So instead of our assertion, maybe we could create a trigger that would essentially make it so if the employee is found to have a department that works in a city, they would be relocated to a different department, meaning they would either change cities or just work for a fully different department. So that's a good example of how a trigger could be used over an assertion. And these are invoked on any update to the database. So anytime you're inserting, anytime you're deleting, anytime the information in your database changes, the trigger is called. So almost once you code it in there, it's stuck, it's stuck there forever. Obviously you can drop it, but you don't need to worry about it not running because every modification that you do will have this trigger running. So that's just some things I found interesting about assertions and that sort of thing. Obviously, the same syntax applies where you can do the alter table method and drop the constraint and insert constraint name, whatever your constraint is, and that'll work the same way, as well as with triggers. So that's something to keep in mind as well. All right, I think that's it. I hope you enjoyed my presentation and found it useful. And yeah, thank you.